So I'm going to introduce Adam to you just very briefly and then hand over to him. Adam is a colleague, a friend. He has extensive experience from, I think it's coming on 30 years now, of working in multi-stakeholder complex situations in over 50 countries. I first met Adam 20 years ago. And when I heard him telling the stories of the work that he had done in South Africa, Colombia, Guatemala, and elsewhere, I decided that this was the work that I wanted to do because I was so inspired by hearing his stories. And so I hope his stories will inspire you as well. I find Adam to be a very good storyteller. That has also led him to write multiple books in which he tells his stories, but also draws out learnings and interpretations of what these stories mean. And so he's written 4 books and is writing his 5th book now. The first book is called Solving Tough Problems. The second book is called Power and Love, which he has a poster of behind him. The third book is Transformative Scenario Planning, which is a book specifically about this approach, which we recommend if you would like to read more cases and read more about the method. And then his 4th and most recent book is called Collaborating with the Enemy, How to Work with People You Don't Agree with, Like, or Trust. So that gives you a sense of what some of the things Adam writes about are, and his most recent book is about facilitation, which is still forthcoming. So we appreciate you taking the time, Adam, to join us for the session, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. I'll explain a little bit about my background, but I have been doing this scenario work for 32 years, all day, every day. Lots of trial, lots of error, lots of learning. So I want to share with you some of what I've learned. What I'm going to say is obvious, but I always feel compelled to say it, that this is a way of working together on complex issues, not a magic trick. I don't know of any magic tricks in this field. And anybody who's been trying to work on the issues that most of us work on have figured this out already, but I never want to be misunderstood as saying that if you do this, everything will be fine, because I don't believe that. I'm deliberately showing you the conclusion at the beginning, which is that I'm going to talk to you about this way of working, which we call transformative scenarios process. And most of what I say and most of the way people talk about this has to do with an intellectual activity, developing new insights or learnings. So we tend to focus in talking about scenarios on the intellectual aspect, new ways of understanding the situation, new insights, learnings. I discovered in Spanish there's no exact word for insights, so they call it revelations. So revelations and learnings. But in my experience with doing this work, the other 2 aspects that are equally important, maybe more important, are how working together in this way creates new relationships or networks or alliances and a new capacity to work together. And out of those 3 components, actions and initiatives, transformative actions and initiatives can arise. Okay, this is a map that one of my colleagues 30 years ago used to show often when he talked about scenarios. It's a map by a Dutch map maker named Herman Mol. He drew this map in 1701. It's a map of North America. And in some respects, it's quite accurate, the Great Lakes, Florida, Hudson's Bay. But there's an inaccurate part of this map, which is that he drew California as an island, which strictly speaking, at least physically, California is not an island. What's interesting about this is that other maps, the Spanish maps, for example, of this period, were correct in this regard. And but people used Herman Moll's map, and there's a famous story of explorers having landed at what is now Monterey, wanting to go inland and disassembling their wooden boats and carrying them over the Sierra Nevada mountains in anticipation of finding the water and only finding desert. And they wrote to Moll and say, hey, we used your map. It doesn't correspond to the territory. And he said, you were in the wrong place. I've talked to people who sailed around California. Map's correct. And Moll didn't change his map until 1721, 20 years later. So the reason this is a famous story amongst scenarists is that if you get your facts wrong, you'll get your map wrong. And if you get your map wrong, you'll do the wrong things. And even beyond that, it's if you have a map, if you have a way of understanding how things are, it's not always easy to realize that it's wrong and to change it. So this is scenario work is map making. The kind of scenario work we're talking about here is collective map making. And I'd be curious whether there are examples from your experience of where you've had a map, you were sure it was right, you acted on it, and it wasn't right, and you did the wrong thing. Okay. Scenarios are a common tool in the military. We're planning on trying to make a certain move. We don't know whether our opponents are on the right or on the left. We tell different scenarios about what could happen. Scenarios became used outside the military, first in the corporate sector, particularly in Shell, the oil company, which started to do scenario work in 1972. The word scenarios, it comes from the word of films. It means the outline of a story. And this was a set of scenarios done in 1972 by some analysts at Shell, talked about the possibility of a crisis in the oil market. Nobody paid any attention to these scenarios at all. They were considered just some strange idea from the planning department. But as you know, there was a very important oil shock in 1973. And as a result of this and other events, Shell rose from being the last of the so-called Seven Sisters to being the first. So this is how scenarios started to be popular in the business sphere. They're now used also in non-governmental organizations and in governments. It's always interesting to me that the government which most uses scenarios or has the longest history of using scenarios is the government of Singapore, which understands itself to be a country that mostly has to adapt to what's going on around it and has used scenarios in the Prime Minister's office for about 30 years. So what I mean by scenario, this is important, it's a hypothesis about the future, about what could happen, meet certain criteria, relevant, challenging, plausible areas. But the crucial point is it's a story about what could happen, not about what will happen, not about what should happen. And this is really interesting about why telling stories about what's possible rather than what's desirable can be so useful. Anyway, I was working in Shell at the scenario department. I was head of global political, economic, social scenarios. And in 1991, I was invited to advise a team in South Africa, which was just coming out of this legally enforced racial segregation called apartheid, this violent oppression. Nelson Mandela had just been released from prison, and two academics at a Black university in Cape Town, University of Western Cape, had this idea that the Shell scenario methodology could be useful to think about the transition in South Africa. There had been several corporate scenario exercises in South Africa before that. And so the original title of what became known as the Montfleur scenario exercise was an alternative scenario planning exercise of the left. And the meetings were held at this little conference center in the wine country outside of Cape Town called the Montfleur Conference Center. They wanted somebody from Shell to provide methodological advice. I was the youngest and most expendable member of the team and was dispatched in September 1991 to facilitate this. And what Peter and Vincent did, nobody had ever done before in the world of scenarios. In Shell, scenarios had been a staff function, something that staff with academics did for the executives of the company. But one of my Shell colleagues suggested I advise the South Africans to include some awkward sods. I say this just because it's a funny kind of British thing to say. And they took this seriously, and they composed the scenario team of people from all across almost every part of the political, social, cultural world of South Africa, left and right, black and white, opposition and establishment, men and women, business, politics, civil society. And this was really extraordinary. And I'll just tell you one story from this experience. Mila said I'm writing a new book, and this is the Montfleur story I want to tell. Trevor Manuel at the time was the head of economics of the African National Congress. That was the just legalized party of Nelson Mandela, which was not yet in government. And his department had issued I don't know what you'd call it, a policy paper. And the title of the policy paper was Growth Through Redistribution. This is the official policy of the party, that economic growth would happen through redistributing money from rich whites to poor blacks. And at the first meeting of the Montfleur scenario team, I asked the team to brainstorm possible stories, what could happen, not what should happen. And Trevor said, I'd like to propose a story called Growth Through Repression, the Chilean model. And this was a very interesting thing for him to say. He was, of course, making a play on words, but he was, through this play on words, talking about something he didn't want to happen, and that was actually directly antithetical to his party's official position, to which he devoted his whole adult life. And this idea that scenarios enabled people to say things and discuss things and consider possibilities other than those that were their official position was, for me, the big clue. Mosabuyane Malatsi at the time was the head of economics for the radical Black Pan-Africanist Congress that had not yet renounced the armed struggle. He told a story of the Chinese army coming to the support of the liberation movement. And his colleagues said, why would they do that? And he said, he didn't have any answer, and he sat down and he never mentioned it again. So this idea also of forcing people to justify their narratives, and in this particular case, Malatsi helped his party agree to enter the first democratic elections. These were the stories they came up with. They used a method very similar to what you'll be using in this course in the sessions that follow. These scenarios aren't relevant in the Middle East in 2020. They're not relevant in South Africa in 2020, but they were very relevant in South Africa in 1992. They exactly captured the possibilities, not just a good possibility, Flight of the Flamingos, but what was much more influential were the three warnings about the three ways that the country could fail in its transition. Trevor Manuel ended up joining the Mandela cabinet in 1994, was a Minister of Finance for 13 years, and said once, it's not a straight line from Montfleur to our current policy. It meanders through, but there's a fair amount of that all going back to Montfleur. I could close my eyes now and give you those scenarios just like this. I've internalized them, and if you've internalized something, then you carry it for life. The paradox of this work, which I'm sure you'll get into, is that we do this work because we're committed to creating a better future, but we do this work through never talking about the future we want, at least through the core of the process, only talking about what's possible. Okay, the methodology we used at Montfleur was identical to the methodology we used at Shell, but something was fundamentally different. And so I wondered about that. And what I realized is the methodology was the same, but the purpose was different. In Shell, we told stories to adapt to a future we couldn't predict or control. Even a big company like Shell can't control oil markets or energy markets. The South Africans couldn't control what would happen, but the reason they were doing it is because they wanted to try to change the future. And so that's why we call this methodology transformative scenarios or transformative scenario planning. I'll tell you a second story. I don't often quote Alcoholics Anonymous slogans, but this particular one is precisely correct for scenario planning. It's about accepting and adapting to things we cannot change or influence, and knowing what we can change and influence. So this is the domain of transformative scenario work. The second story I want to tell is from Colombia. At the time I worked there 25 years ago, the civil war was ongoing, particularly the civil war with the FARC, the large guerrilla army. And there was a politician named Juan Manuel Santos, out of office, went to South Africa, got to meet his hero, Nelson Mandela, who told him about the Montfleur process, suggested it might be interesting in Colombia. And Santos decided to try to organize a process that eventually became known as Destino Colombia, Destiny Colombia. By that time, I had resigned from Shell, emigrated from London to Cape Town, married the organizer of Montfleur. And this was the first big project I did outside of South Africa. And it was different from Montfleur in that it involved all of the armed factions. It was really very extraordinary. Actually, it will amuse you to know that the government offered safe passage to the FARC and ELN guerrillas and the so-called self-defense forces, the right-wing paramilitary. But the FARC and ELN did not believe that it would be safe to come to the meetings, and they participated in 9 full days of meetings by speakerphone. So I realized that we have 25 years of experience with virtual scenario processes. Lots of amazing things happened through those conversations. In fact, we had a reunion of the Destino Colombia team 2 weeks ago, and one of the FARC guerrillas whose face I'd never seen, in fact, whose identity I never knew, was at the reunion. So this, in a way, was a more adventurous process, and produced, again, 4 scenarios. And through some very strange, I don't even know what the right word is, strange coincidence or synchronicity, the 4 scenarios have happened in Colombia exactly in the order in which they were written, with Uribe trying to implement Forward March, a scenario of pacification, and Santos, when he became president, trying to implement unity-lies strength. Here, the interesting thing is, in a completely hopeless situation, Colombia in the midst of a war, unlike the Montfleur scenarios, here were 3 ways Colombia could exit from the mess, 3 different ways. The group did not at all agree on which was a preferable scenario. Tomorrow will come and we'll see, as a scenario of things staying the same. Bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush is about a negotiated solution. Forward March is about pacification of the country, destruction of the opposition. And in unity of lies strength was a scenario that most people thought was implausible, about a bottom-up civil society transformation of the society. Lots of things aren't going well in Colombia, like everywhere else in the world, but at that reunion a few weeks ago, I remembered that nobody speaks about Colombia as a failed state anymore. So there has been some progress. Santos, the organizer of Destino Colombia, became the president of Colombia. He achieved his dream which went all the way back to Montfleur, of making a peace treaty with the FARC. On the day that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, he said two things that really interested me. He said, it's truly breathtaking to read the Destino Columbia scenarios because they're more prophetic than academic. So this is interesting. The possibility of actually to see what is really possible in a complex and conflictual and confusing situation. But what he also said that I thought was very interesting, when I talked to him about this, he said the reason he remembered Destino Columbia is that's where he realized that it is possible, contrary to all of his political and familial cultural upbringing, to work with people you do not agree with and will never agree with. And this, for me, is the larger potential of this approach. Not how we can all agree, but how we can find a way to work together in spite of permanent disagreement. In English, we say coexistence, but in Spanish, they say convivencia, which has a slightly different connotation. Convivencia is what a couple does together. And those of you who are in a couple or in a family know that it's partly a matter of how to live with permanent difference. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit because I want to tell you a third story. One of the things Santos was very interested in his presidency was the drug problem. As you know, Colombia is a major producer of cocaine and heroin, marijuana, and had been demonized for this in a very humiliating way, humiliating for Colombians. And Santos started to talk about this. And the analogy he used is he said, on this issue, he said at his speech, on this issue, we sometimes feel the world is pedaling on a stationary bicycle. We keep fighting against drugs, but the drugs continue to flow. And I saw Santos because I launched one of my books in Colombia, and I got literally a minute to talk to him. And I said, you really liked this work we did in Colombia. Why don't we try to do something on drugs? And he said, well, I have this Summit of the Americas coming up. Just before I get to that, what's really interesting about the drug issue that you may or may not know is it's subject to a very rigid approach. The same approach tried over and over, what Richard Nixon called the war on drugs, this series of international conventions, this emphasis on interdiction of drugs, on criminalization of drug consumption. Santos that year was hosting the Summit of the Americas, the 32 heads of state of the countries in the Americas, and he proposed that the scenario process be used to see if there were alternatives to the established mechanism. He gave that mandate, or they gave that mandate to the Organization of American States, diplomatic organization, and Rios and the OAS partnered on this project. And the official declaration was interesting to explore new approaches. So he wasn't saying that they had to do something different, but he wanted to look at, are there other ways to deal with this problem? And Mila and I worked on this process. It was very interesting. It involved a team of people from across the Americas. I mean, I know it may seem strange to you, but people who really don't agree, military people, health people, legalization people, indigenous people, government officials from countries from Chile to Canada. And this is a slightly different use of scenarios. This is my final example. But the project was titled The Drug Problem in the Americas, which first, at the beginning, I thought was a very unfortunate title because in my way of thinking about this work, these things are never as simple as a problem. But the four scenarios became different ways of understanding the problem, different ways of defining the problem, and different ways of responding to it. And this really was a big deal in the global drug policy community, because it's the first time there had ever been an official study, an official effort that acknowledged that there might be some alternative to treating drugs primarily as a security problem or as a criminal problem. And in particular, the idea that there could be alternative legal and regulatory regimes and health-oriented approaches was really dramatic and has had a big impact globally and in the Americas. In fact, yesterday, for example, the province of British Columbia became the first jurisdiction, I think, in the Americas, maybe the second, to decriminalize all drugs. I think I'm getting this correct. I haven't read the exact announcement. Or with the hypothesis that this was a manifestation of underlying drug problems, underlying dysfunctions that require a different approach. And this, so here was an example of scenarios being used to explore alternative possibilities and to unfreeze a frozen policy debate, to provide a new common framework, to generate new policy options, and to agree a new way forward together. So I'll end as I began, just to say that I've focused, and most people talk about scenarios focusing on insights, learnings, new possibilities, new ways of thinking, which is true, and there's lots of reasons why it's very good for that. But at least in my experience, particularly in fragmented and polarized settings, the capacity to build new relationships and a capacity to collaborate even with people we disagree with. I've been working for 5 years with a team in Mexico. They have a WhatsApp group that I'm on, and I notice after 5 years they still disagree about everything they disagreed about 5 years ago, but they're able to do many, many things together. They don't agree, but they like and trust each other. And they call their project, Possible Mexico's, a living example of a different way of working together. So I'm just re-emphasizing that although we tend in scenario work to focus on insights and learnings, these other two legs of the stool are equally important for being able to change things in the world. So let me stop there.